Hey, so in this video, I want to introduce just briefly what Christians think about the future. This is kind of one of those fundamental questions that exists in many of the world religions, uh, which is basically like, where is this whole thing going? So you can see this question down here, where is the world going? That is, in a sense, one of the larger questions that Christians or that religious people in general try to answer. The formal word of this is eschatology. Eschatology can mean a variety of things. It can mean the idea that history is progressing towards a decisive moment. It can mean like the last things. That's kind of the more popular version in kind of just popular America. But then also this other question, where is the world going? In order, though, to answer this question, I want to go back and I want to revisit some of the themes that we've addressed so far in the class. So please remember, first and foremost, that Christians assert, so do Jews and Muslims, that God created the world and the world was good. That God gave humans a special responsibility in that created order. And remember, from a doctrine of creation, this responsibility has to do with care of the world. That one of the main vocations of the human agent is to be the caretaker of the earth. Remember, Christians say that there is goodness in creation, and it's not just focused on humans. They argue that all of God's creation is good. It's not just me because I'm a human being, I'm good, and I can do whatever I want to other things because they are not human. Rather, the Christian idea of creation is that God created all, and therefore it is good. So remember then, God's intention for creation was to live at one in relationship with God and fellow creatures. You see this particularly in the narrative in Genesis 1 and 2. If you look at those narratives, all of creation lives in harmony. The wide variety of animals, they all live in harmony. You see this also in the book of Isaiah and other parts in the Hebrew Bible, that the intentions of the world by God are for there to be no predator and prey, but to have all the world live in peace and in harmony. So, to continue some of these theological convictions, God gives utter freedom to God's creation. Now, for sure, in that doctrine of providence, we can talk about how God does interact with the world, but Christians do assert that there is freedom in creation. In fact, that is one of my favorite books by a very famous theologian called Freedom in Creation. That just try to really unpack what does it mean to be a created, but also to be free. So remember, and please, this is probably a very important theme here, that Christians assert that God is not ruled by force, power, violence, or might. Now, yes, God does influence what happens in the world. However, God does not limit freedom, going up here, by being all powerful. Christians, yes, they do assert that God is all powerful. However, they also say that God limits God's power for the sake of love, for the sake of freedom. Estrangement is another word for sin. So after sin is part of the human condition, God's desire is to redeem the world. You see this throughout the vast majority of the Hebrew Bible and continuing into the New Testament. That God's desire for creation is to live again as the created order that God once created. So therefore, through the prophets, God called people into relationship with him. You see this in the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, in the Hebrew Bible. So God's redemption for Christians is seen most fully in Jesus, the person that Christians call the Christ. That God's salvific work for the world happened uniquely and particularly in the life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. And Christians then believe that Jesus' resurrection had universal significance. If you go back to some of what we said about Jesus, remember that his victory over the cross is really a victory over the powers and principalities of this world. So then the resurrection started what Christians call the world being put back to the way in which God intended it to be. They call this the kingdom of God. And so what you see in Jesus and in the whole Christ event is that history is progressing towards a uniquely decisive moment. And so this is going to lead us to asking some very particular questions. If God's desire for the world, and these questions came from a student of mine a couple of years ago, if God's desire for the world is redemption and restoration, would God just let the world go to hell? In other words, is God kind of like this deist God who is just sitting out wherever God is in heaven and just watching the world go to hell? That's a really important question to answer. A really important question is similar to this. So what is the world, or what is the end, what does the future look like if Christians really do worship a God of redemption? So try to get this in your mind. Remember that the vast majority of the Hebrew Bible and almost all of the New Testament is focused on the redemptive act of God. That God is in the process of redeeming the world, of setting the world back to the way in which God intended it to be. Um, and often I get the question, well, why doesn't the world look better than it is? Yeah, well, that's because God chooses to use human beings. And as we've already learned, human beings have a fundamental flaw, which Christians call sin. But notice this. So, what does the end of the world look like if God really is a God of redemption? That is a key question here. If God's redeeming love really is at the heart of who God is, what does the end look like? What does the future look like? So is heaven the goal of Christianity? And therefore, then what does heaven mean? Again, all of these questions are coming from students. So I want to try to address these in some different ways here. Here, we have to really look at perspective. There are two types of theological traditions, and I want to kind of bring two to light and then elaborate on one. One would just be a theology of despair, that the world is going to hell, that the world is getting worse and worse and worse. And so what the believer would say is, well, I'm just going to wait for God or wait for death to be united to Christ. This has been suddenly oddly popular in the last maybe 100 to 150 years or so in certain parts of the world. These are the people who say just the world is bad, it's full of evil, it's full of violence. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wait until death to be united to Christ. You can juxtapose that to what Christians call a theology of hope. And this is really what we see in the best parts of Christian theology. The world is in the process of being redeemed by God in Christ. And if that's the case, then there is hope not only for today, not only for my own life, my family, for my communities, but for the entire world. Jürgen Moltmann is one of the theologians that we read in this class. And one of his earliest books is actually titled this, The Theology of Hope. Because Christian theology is necessarily a theology of hope. And let me go back and show you why. It's because of all of these statements that we began with. That God is the God who created the world. That God is the God who had these beautiful intentions for the world to live in harmony. And therefore, then, if all of this is true, particularly where we start to talk about God's redemptive purposes in Jesus, then there is hope not only for today, but for the future. So, out of these two perspectives, we are going to operate out of this one, a theology of hope, that the world is in the process of being redeemed, is in the process of being set back to the way in which God intended it to be. Now here, I want to go back just for a second and allude to a great poem. If you're into poetry, look it up. It's by T.S. Eliot, and it's called East Coker. He has this really interesting phrase that he works with in this poem that says, "In the end is my beginning." So in the end is my beginning. And he says that a few times at the first part of the poem. And then at the very end, he says, "And in the beginning is my end." You see, what you'll find in the next few minutes is the future goal of the world for Christians is very, very, very similar to Genesis 1 and 2. In Genesis 1 and 2, you see this beautiful garden. You see the world as living in harmony, in peace. And that actually is a very accurate picture of what Christians hope for in the end of the world or in the future. That humanity, that all of God's creation lives in peace and harmony. And I'll show you that biblically here in a little bit. Now, there is a popular idea of heaven, particularly in kind of the Western world of the last 150, 200 years, that when one dies, their soul is taken off to heaven. The heaven is the end, the telos, the goal of the Christian life. I remember thinking this growing up, that the goal of life is to get to heaven. And so I remembered when I was really young, I was raised in the church, and I remember becoming a Christian. Well, I became a Christian at a young age because I wanted to go to heaven. As I've matured, I've realized kind of what this word means. The word heaven really means the place where God is, the place where God resides. Now, notice how dualistic this phrase is. That when one dies, their soul goes off to heaven. I'm going to unpack that a little bit more here in just a second. So does this have Christian roots? Remember the discussion about dualism in the doctrine of creation. Remember, dualism was really influenced by the great philosopher Plato, and they really believed that there were two realms, that there was a realm of becoming down here, and then there was a realm of being. He called the realm of being the forms. And remember how we talked about like that there was the soul up here, and then there was the body down here. There was good up here, and then evil down here. Above the line, there was spirit, and below the line, there was matter. Above the line, there would be souls, and below the line, there would be bodies. Remember, the Christians are not dualists. The early Jews, they very much believed in kind of this philosophers are going to call it several things, but just this oneness in a sense that I as a human being, I'm not just a body and a soul, but there is something kind of holistic about who I am. Remember, so what did the Jews then believe about the afterlife? This is going to be kind of a driving question here. The Jews believed that when everybody died, good, bad, old, young, they all go to a place called Sheol. Sheol was basically just a way to talk about the grave. Everybody they would believe would die. The righteous unrighteous alike, they would all go to Sheol. And what the Jews believed about the end of the world is they would wait what was called the final resurrection of the body, when God would set the world right and then raise up all of God's people to live with God. And here's the kicker, on the earth. The Jews believed in a bodily resurrection. Remember, we talked about this in the New Testament class too, that the righteous and the unrighteous alike, they would all die, they would go to the grave, they would be with God. But then on that great day, when God finally restored the world to the way in which God intended it, he would raise up God's people and they would live in harmony with God. This was the Jewish belief in the afterlife. Remember, the Jews, they did not believe in a body and a soul. They didn't believe that souls would like kind of float off to heaven. What the Jews believed and what Jesus believed as a first century Jew is that when one died, they would be with God, but their bodies would be waiting that final resurrection. Here, there's a major problem with language. So remember, in the original language, Hebrew meant, or Sheol meant grave. Whenever you translate this, however, into Greek, you come up with two words. The first word is Gehenna. And actually, let me show you Gehenna. This is a picture right here of Gehenna. It's outside of Jerusalem, and you can see it's a big valley. It's not, I mean, I say outside Jerusalem, you can see part of the city, but it's right kind of in the vicinities of the main city of Jerusalem. What Gehenna was used for at the time of Jesus was it was the dump. It was the city place where people would take their trash. And if you've ever lived kind of out in rural areas, you know that trash in many parts of the world, even today, is burned. At the time of Jesus, they would burn their trash down here. And this was, again, where the outcasts would go. The sinners, the outcasts, the people who had certain diseases, they would live out here in Gehenna. And so in the New Testament, whenever we hear Jesus, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, who says, if your right arm causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for that member to burn in hell than the entire body to burn in hell. Well, the word in Greek there is Gehenna. It really is. It is better for a member of your body to kind of burn in the trash rather than your entire body. Now, if you also translate this in Greek, you start to have the influence of another major Greek theme, which is Hades. Now, Hades should elicit in your mind immediately two things. One, an underworld, okay, and a Greek god of the underworld. And so we're starting, whenever we translate this very Jewish idea of resurrection, when we start translating this in the New Testament into Greek, we run into some really big issues. Now, we run into larger issues when we translate this into English because we get the language of hell. And whenever we have the language of hell, we start to see the influence of these Greek words that have really influenced how people think about hell in the modern world. A lot of people think of hell in a very Greek sense, that there is a god of the underworld. They call that god like Lucifer or the devil, and that it is a place of like fire and torture. What's interesting to me is some of these images do come from the Hebrew Bible, or from the New Testament times, where they would would burn their trash in Gehenna, but a lot of them also come from literature, particularly Dante's Divine Comedy, and even more particularly Dante's Inferno. Before you go to college, you have to sit down and read Dante's Divine Comedy. You see, in this epic poem, Dante in the 11th and 12th, or the 12th, yeah, 12th and 13th century in Italy, was writing this beautiful epic poem. But it's so interesting to me, having studied this stuff, that the modern view of hell is more influenced here by Dante's Divine Comedy, or later on by John Milton's Paradise Lost, than anything that we see in the New Testament times. And in a sense, this idea has been somewhat lost in the modern world. So to continue, early Christians, what they believed, and please start to really pay attention here, is that Jesus' resurrection meant that God's final future was now. Remember, if you've studied anything of N.T. Wright, you will know this to be true. The N.T. Wright clearly argues that the resurrection of Jesus means that God's eschatological future is a present reality. Another way to say that is that heaven is breaking into the present. So that Jesus then is on the throne. Jesus is the king, and early Christians believed that the world would soon end. The dead would be raised, and God would recreate the world as God intended it to be. Take a picture of this. Be sure you get this in your notes, because the early Christians really believed in Jesus' resurrection. And as Jesus was raised from the dead, because they were very good Jews, they also believed that all people would be raised from the dead. But when one person was raised from the dead, that then therefore meant, for these early Christians, that God's future was breaking into the present, that God's kingdom was here on earth. And this is why, perhaps, Christians every day when they pray the Lord's Prayer, they say, "Thy kingdom come on earth." On earth. Please get that. Thy kingdom come on earth. Now remember, Greek philosophy did influence Christian theology. You start to see early aspects of this in the late 2nd century, but particularly in the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, Christians started to sound a lot like the Greeks. They started to sound a lot like their Roman counterparts. Remember, because Christianity in the year 312 and 313 was fundamentally changed by the actions of Emperor Constantine. We start to see the influence of Greek and Roman philosophy on Christian theology. And so dualism began to deeply infiltrate and influence Christian theology. But remember, Jesus was Jewish. Jesus was not a dualist, and Jesus believed in resurrection. Jesus did not believe in souls floating off to heaven. Rather, Jesus believed in a bodily resurrection. And so there are some people in America who, and this requires a very, very, very literal reading of the book of Revelation, they say that we are living in the last days. And they say that what is going to happen is God is going to come back, going to take Christians up to heaven, and that the world is going to end in a fiery furnace. A lot of this is really influenced by a popular book series of maybe the 1990s called Left Behind. What's interesting, and I'm going to show you where this is different from the biblical witness, is this requires a very, very, very unique read of a couple verses in the New Testament. If you want to, I'm going to attach this on the website. You can take a look of some of these links because they're really helpful. But look at this. This is the final vision of the world in the New Testament. So in the book of Revelation, the second to last chapter of the Bible, you see this image, and listen to this language. The author is saying, "And then I saw," this is kind of looking in future terms, "a new heaven and the new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more." Now, listen to this language, it's beautiful. "Then I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And then I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'See the home.'" Listen to that. The abode of Yahweh, the home of God is among mortals. And it's not the other way around. It doesn't say that the home of mortals is with God, but the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them as their God. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. A very beautiful image here. "He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And then the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." He also said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy or true." And then he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha, the Omega, the beginning and to the end. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift," and so on and so forth. Revelation 21, this is the final vision of the world in the New Testament. Again, there are these links, and they are very, very, very helpful here. But I want you to see that this final vision looks very, very, very similar to Genesis 1 and 2. You see this beautiful vision of a new heaven and a new earth. And the question is, where is it? Look right here. And I saw the holy city, a new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. The reason that Christianity is a theology of hope is that Christians fundamentally have hope that God is in the process of redeeming God's creation, of setting the world back to rights, of bringing about a new heaven and a new earth. They say that this began in the Christ event and that this will end in the final second coming of God, when God sets the world back to right. Notice in this vision, you don't see the world ending in destruction. You don't see the world ending in fire and in flames. You see the world ending in a very beautiful image of the way in which it began. Remember T.S. Eliot, "In the end is my beginning, and in the beginning is my end." So Christianity has come full circle. The eschatological hope of Christianity is that the people of God will be with God when God recreates the earth, that the dead will be raised, that we will be with the ancestors of the past, our family members and our friends who have died, but that we will be doing God's work on earth. Remember, Christians are not dualists. This does challenge a little bit of the modern kind of contemporary view of heaven, but the final view of heaven is to be with God when God recreates the world, when God creates the world to the final and the fullest form of the way in which God intended it to be. And so if you want to, we can go back really quickly to these early questions again that were asked by students. The whole idea of eschatology is really interesting, perhaps because it is a theology of hope. Christianity is fundamentally a theology of hope because God's desire is for redemption. It's for restoration. God's desire is not for the world to just go to hell. And therefore then, Christians do worship a God of redemption. And so the end of the world looks like the way in which God intended it to be. So the final question is, does it matter how I live? Does it matter, if God is just going to set the world back to right, does it really matter how I act? I think that it does matter because the call of Christians is to live as eschatological people now, to live as if this new heaven, this new earth is a present reality here on earth. Does it matter how I live now? Absolutely. I have to welcome the outsider. I have to care for the widow, the orphan, the illegal alien. I have to welcome the very people who it is so easy for me to ostracize and to condemn as being other than me. In other words, as the Christian, and here you can bring in the whole discussion on Christian ethics. What it means to be Christian in this eschatological sense is to live as God's future now, to be a part of this kingdom, to be a part of God's making the world right, to setting the world right to a world of justice and peace, the way in which God intended it to be. Christian theology is necessarily a theology of hope. Christians worship a God who has a deep and profound sense of an eschatological hope where God is setting the world back to right. And that is the final vision of the New Testament.